The morning after Camilla's exile, the palace felt like a living ghost. The walls, once filled with chatter and footsteps of staff preparing for daily engagements, now stood in an eerie stillness. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Even the air seemed to carry the residue of shame and disbelief. The king had risen early, as he often did, but this morning was different. There was no valet helping him into his suit, no soft murmur of schedule briefings, no sound at all except the faint tick of the antique clock that had belonged to his mother. For the first time since his coronation, King Charles felt the crushing solitude of his title. He had sent away the one person who knew him not as monarch, but as man, and though it was his own command, it left a silence he could not bear. Outside the palace gates, the world was already awake with speculation. Cameras lined the streets, reporters huddled in clusters, and news anchors spoke with exaggerated urgency. Unprecedented royal move, one headline declared. King Charles banishes Queen Camilla to secluded monastery, said another. The press had found its story of the decade. Across the nation, breakfast tables buzzed with disbelief. Some defended the king, calling his decision necessary to preserve royal dignity. Others condemned it as cruel and archaic, a punishment unworthy of modern times. But no one could deny one truth: Britain had never seen anything like it. Inside the royal household, uncertainty reigned. Senior aides whispered behind closed doors, their loyalty divided between the monarch and the woman they had served for years. Many had seen the deterioration long before the public ever caught a glimpse. The tension between Charles and Camilla had been visible to those who dared to look. There were late-night arguments behind locked doors, cold glances exchanged at state dinners, and long absences that were explained away as health breaks or personal time. To outsiders, their marriage appeared polished. To insiders, it was a volcano waiting to erupt. 3 weeks after Camilla's disappearance into quiet exile, Buckingham Palace became the scene of one of the most intense royal meetings in modern history. The press and public knew nothing of it, only that the king had cancelled all public appearances for the next 48 hours. Behind the gilded walls of the palace, a small group of senior royals and advisors gathered in absolute secrecy to determine the future of the monarchy. The stakes were high, and the tension was suffocating. For the first time since his coronation, King Charles was forced to face his closest allies and answer an unspoken question that had haunted the halls since the night of the scandal. How far would he go to protect the crown from his own household? The meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but Charles arrived early. The room chosen for the gathering, the Lancaster Room, had always carried a sense of history. It was the same chamber where Queen Elizabeth II once held her most difficult wartime briefings, where decisions that shaped the nation were made in whispers. The air was cold, still scented faintly with the polish of oak and the echo of past authority. Charles stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing out over the courtyard. From where he stood, he could see the royal guards changing formation, the ceremonial rhythm of duty continuing even as his own house stood on the brink of moral collapse. The first to arrive was Princess Anne. True to her reputation, she walked in briskly, her expression businesslike, her voice calm. "You look tired, Charles," she said simply, not as judgment but as observation. "I'm fine," he replied, though the shadows beneath his eyes told another story. "You're not," she countered, taking her seat at the far end of the table. "But I suspect that's not what we're here to discuss." Moments later came Prince William, accompanied by the private secretary and Lord Chamberlain. William's demeanor was composed, yet one could sense the weight of unspoken frustration beneath his measured politeness. He greeted his father with a nod, then took his seat beside Anne. The private secretary placed a folder before each of them, stamped with the royal seal. Inside were documents outlining the current crisis, public sentiment metrics, media reports, and internal assessments of the monarchy's stability. The numbers were brutal. Trust in the royal household had dropped significantly, with public support for the Queen Consort's return sitting in the single digits. The monarchy had not seen such a divide in modern times. When everyone was seated, Charles began without preamble. "You all know why we're here," he said. His tone was low, steady, but there was a current of fatigue beneath it. "We've endured scandals before, many in fact, but this one is different. It cuts to the heart of the monarchy itself. It's not just a question of image. It's a question of credibility. And right now, the world believes the crown is cracking." And leaned forward. "You mean it is cracking?" she said. "You can't send the queen consort away without consequence. Whatever justification we give, it looks like instability. The public sees a fractured family. That's what terrifies them." Charles nodded slowly. "Instability can be managed," he said. "But ridicule cannot. She humiliated the institution before the world, and I can forgive many things, but not that." William spoke next, his voice calm but resolute. "You're right about ridicule, but this silence isn't working. People are filling in the blanks themselves. Some think she's been locked away, others think she's dead. We're losing control of the narrative." Charles glanced at him sharply. "You'd prefer I parade her through the streets, then?" William didn't flinch. "I'd prefer honesty. Say she's unwell. Say she's seeking spiritual healing. People respect vulnerability more than silence." The king looked down at his hands, the knuckles pale against the polished wood of the table. "Vulnerability," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. "The last thing this crown can afford right now is vulnerability." At that moment, the Lord Chamberlain interjected with a measured tone. "If I may, Your Majesty, there is another matter to consider. The Prime Minister has requested reassurance that this arrangement will not interfere with upcoming state business. They're concerned about perception abroad. The Americans and the French have already issued polite inquiries." Charles exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "I am not in the business of explaining my personal life to foreign governments," he said coldly. "If they wish to question my judgment, let them remember the centuries this institution has stood without their approval." And exchanged a brief glance with William. They both knew that tone. It was the voice of their father when cornered, the one that brooked no opposition. But this time and decided to press forward. "Charles, this isn't about foreign approval. It's about the people. Mother understood that better than anyone. They want to believe you're steady, that you're compassionate. Exile makes you look cruel. You may think you're protecting the monarchy, but what if you're killing it slowly?" The words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. The king's jaw tightened, and for a moment, no one dared to speak. When he finally did, his voice was quiet but heavy with emotion. "Do you know what it is to be humiliated in front of the world by the person you trusted most?" His gaze shifted from one face to another. "I stood there, before presidents, before the Commonwealth, before the people, and she mocked everything I am. Everything the crown represents. Tell me, and how does one forgive that?" There was no answer. The silence said everything. William finally broke it. "You don't have to forgive her to show mercy," he said. "You can hold her accountable without making her a ghost." The king turned toward him slowly, studying his son's face. "You speak as though you've never been betrayed," he said softly. "I have," William replied. "But I learned that punishment doesn't always heal what's broken." The discussion shifted then to strategy. The private secretary presented options: a gradual reintroduction of Camilla to public life through charitable causes, a public statement emphasizing reflection and renewal, or, if necessary, the formal removal of her title. Each proposal carried risk. Public sympathy might grow if she appeared contrite, but it could just as easily turn to outrage if she returned too soon. The monarchy was walking a knife's edge, balancing perception against principle. As the meeting went on, Charles grew increasingly silent, his expression hardening. He listened but said little, his mind somewhere far from the table. When Lord Chamberlain mentioned the possibility of Parliament intervening to question royal finances related to Camilla's security detail, Charles's temper finally snapped. "Parliament has no right to interfere in my marriage," he said sharply. "If they wish to challenge the monarchy, let them come to me directly. I won't answer to politicians." His voice rose, echoing off the walls. The room went still. Even Anne, usually unshaken, looked momentarily startled. The outburst faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by the weary composure that now defined him. "This meeting is over," he said quietly. "We'll revisit this when I've made my decision." But the meeting wasn't over, not for William and not for Anne. As the others filed out, they lingered behind. William approached his father cautiously. "You're isolating yourself," he said. "You think you're controlling the narrative, but you're not. You're just feeding their curiosity." Charles didn't respond, and stood by the window, her arms crossed. "He's right," she said. "You can't rule through silence. You're not Mother. Times have changed. People demand transparency now, even from kings." Charles turned toward them, his face etched with exhaustion. "Transparency," he said bitterly. "You mean confession. They don't want the truth, they want blood. They always have." William stepped closer. "Maybe they want both. But if you keep shutting them out, they'll invent their own truths, and those will be worse than any you could tell." For a moment, the king looked as though he might relent. His shoulders slumped slightly, his expression softened. But then the moment passed. He straightened again, the steel returning to his voice. "I appreciate your counsel," he said. "But I must protect the crown in my own way. This family has survived worse. It will survive this too." With that, he dismissed them. After the meeting, Charles retreated to the private library, a place that had become his sanctuary since the crisis began. The shelves were lined with history. Volumes of kings and queens who had faced rebellion, betrayal, exile, and tragedy. He ran his hand along the spines, pausing at one in particular, a biography of Henry VIII. A bitter smile touched his lips. "Even the strongest kings fall to the weight of their wives," he murmured to himself. It wasn't a jest, but a grim reflection of the truth he feared most. Outside, the world continued as though nothing had happened. The palace gates remained guarded, the press remained guessing, and the people remained divided. Inside, however, something fundamental had shifted. The secret royal meeting had not restored order. It had exposed fractures within the family that no amount of protocol could conceal. William and Anne left the palace that day with heavy hearts, both realizing that the man sitting on the throne was no longer the brother or father they once knew. He had become something else entirely, something harder, colder, shaped by loss and humiliation. That night, as the palace lights dimmed, Charles sat alone once more. The minutes stretched into hours as he replayed the meeting in his mind. Every word of criticism, every warning, every plea for compassion echoed back at him. He reached for a pen and began writing again, not letters this time, but thoughts, confessions he would never share. He wrote about pride, about betrayal, about love turned into duty. At the end of the page, he paused, then scribbled one sentence that he underlined twice. "A crown may forgive, but a heart never does." Outside, the wind howled across the courtyard, rattling the old windows. The king looked up from his writing, listening to the sound. It was a lonely sound, empty yet relentless, much like his reign had become. For a moment he considered calling or even William, but he didn't. He extinguished the lamp, closed the journal, and sat in darkness. The monarchy had survived another day, but something within him had broken beyond repair. The weeks leading up to the grand royal event, the one now infamous for its collapse, had been particularly strained. Sources close to the palace recalled how Charles had grown increasingly irritable about logistics, perfectionist about appearances. He wanted the event to symbolize strength and unity, a clear message that the monarchy had emerged from years of controversy, renewed and unshakable. Camilla, however, seemed less interested in symbolism. Those who worked under her described a woman restless, bored with the rehearsed smiles and staged appearances. "She wasn't built for restraint," one aide confessed later. "She wanted attention on her terms, not his." It was this underlying conflict, his devotion to order, her taste for control, that now hung over the monarchy like a fog. As royal advisors gathered that morning, they understood that this crisis was more than a marital spat. it was a matter of national stability. The king's personal life had merged once again with his public role, threatening the very image he had fought so hard to rehabilitate. The monarchy, centuries old and meticulously managed, was now balancing on the edge of scandal. The first meeting of the day took place in the king's private council room. The long oak table, surrounded by portraits of past monarchs, bore witness to whispered debates and hidden tensions. Lord Chamberlain, a man seasoned in royal damage control, spoke first. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "the press is relentless. We've contained nothing. They've already found the monastery's general location. By evening, there'll be satellite photos online." The king listened silently, his expression unreadable. Another aide added, "Public sentiment is split. There's sympathy, but there's also outrage. They think this is exile. Medieval." The word lingered in the air like smoke. Charles finally spoke after several moments of silence. "It is not exile," he said quietly. "It is preservation. Of the crown, of the family, of everything we stand for." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "If they only knew what truly happened that night," he added almost to himself. No one dared to ask what he meant. The details of Camilla's outburst remained tightly sealed within the palace walls, known only to a handful of witnesses. The official story framed it as an unfortunate misunderstanding. The truth, however, was far more personal, far more dangerous to the monarchy's image than anyone outside could imagine. Rumors began circulating among the lower staff that Camilla had deliberately sabotaged the event. One story suggested she had confronted a foreign dignitary, revealing a private disagreement Charles had tried to conceal. Another claimed she had publicly mocked William's speech draft, calling it hollow royal fluff. None of these accounts were confirmed, but all painted the same picture: a queen consort who had gone too far. Her temper, once dismissed as fiery charm, had become a liability. In the following days, Charles refused to speak her name. He moved through his duties with mechanical precision, showing no emotion in public, yet those closest to him sensed the turmoil beneath. At night, he wrote in his personal journals, long handwritten reflections no one was allowed to read. "He's grieving, not angry," one aide confided. "He loved her, truly, but something broke that night. You could see it in his face. The trust was gone." Meanwhile, public reaction continued to evolve. Television panels debated the morality of the king's decision. Psychologists analyzed the royal marriage like a case study. Newspapers published timelines of their relationship, tracing every scandal from the Diana years to this latest crisis. Across Britain, pub conversations and social media threads dissected every angle. Was Camilla's downfall inevitable? Had Charles finally chosen the crown over love? Or was this punishment a quiet act of vengeance? The king remained silent. It was Princess Anne who finally intervened. Known for her bluntness and discretion, she requested a private audience with her brother. Those present said the conversation was long and tense, and reminded him of their mother's legacy, her ability to separate emotion from duty. But she also warned him of the dangers of isolation. "You can't lock yourself away forever, Charles," she reportedly told him. "The crown doesn't forgive weakness, but it also doesn't forget cruelty. You must find balance." Her words struck him deeply. For decades, Anne had been his quiet compass, never sentimental, always firm. That night, Charles stood at his window overlooking the palace gardens. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of London gloom that mirrored his mood. He thought of his mother, of how she had faced storms with composure, even when her family threatened to crumble from within. But he also thought of his father, whose temper and pride had often alienated those closest to him. In that moment, Charles realized he was standing between their legacies, his mother's restraint and his father's fury, and whichever path he chose next would define his reign. Within the palace, conversations grew more urgent. Advisors debated whether the king should address the nation. Transparency might restore trust, one argued, or destroy it completely, another countered. The press office drafted statements that were rewritten, then scrapped entirely. Every word was weighed for implication. Every silence was criticized. The monarchy had entered a dangerous new era, one where even the smallest misstep could ignite global outrage. Among those most affected by the crisis was Prince William. Though he kept a public distance, sources close to him revealed his private frustration. He had spent years trying to modernize the family's image, emphasizing stability and moral strength. Camilla's actions had undone much of that work. Privately, he met with his father, urging him to act decisively but compassionately. "The people will respect clarity," he said. "They won't respect cruelty." Charles nodded but offered no reply. Father and son stood on opposite sides of the same storm, one seeking redemption, the other seeking survival. Behind the scenes, royal historians began drawing comparisons to past monarchs. Some likened the situation to the exile of Wallace Simpson, others to the banishment of mistresses in older reigns. But few could ignore the irony. The woman once scorned for her affair had become queen, only to face disgrace once again. History, one commentator wrote, has a cruel way of circling back to where it began. Days turned into weeks, and the monarchy began to adjust to its new rhythm. Camilla's absence was noticeable, but not publicly acknowledged. Official photographs featured Charles alone or alongside William and Kate. Engagements that once bore the label, "Their Majesties," now carried only His Majesty. It was as if the palace was rewriting reality in plain sight, erasing her presence one announcement at a time. What happened after the event was even more chaotic. Backstage, Camilla was reportedly in tears, shouting at aides and demanding to be driven back to Clarence's house. Charles refused to see her. "I can't speak to her right now," he told his staff. "Not tonight." Witnesses described the atmosphere as electric with tension. Guests whispered, staff avoided eye contact, and the royal family quickly dispersed without their usual goodbyes. That night, as the world debated what had happened, the palace entered lockdown. The next morning, every newspaper front page carried some version of the same story. Royal meltdown. Camilla's outburst shocks the world. Disaster at the palace. Commentators replayed the footage in slow motion, dissecting body language and tone. Psychologists were invited onto talk shows to analyze what might have driven the queen consort to such behavior. Within 24 hours, her approval ratings plummeted. Hashtags calling for her resignation trended across social media platforms. The palace's public relations machine worked tirelessly, but the narrative had already slipped beyond their control. Behind closed doors, Charles was livid. He summoned his inner circle to an emergency meeting. His first words were measured but filled with quiet fury. "This was meant to be our moment," he said. "She turned it into our disgrace." The aides sat in tense silence. No one dared to offer excuses. For the king, the betrayal wasn't just public. It was personal. He had forgiven her before, endured scandals, and weathered ridicule in the name of love. But this time, the insult had been dealt not just to him, but to the institution he had sworn to protect. Camilla, meanwhile, refused to apologize. In private correspondence later leaked to the press, she insisted that she had been provoked and that her words had been taken out of context. She accused Charles's advisors of conspiring against her, of painting her as unstable to undermine her influence. Her defiance only deepened the divide. She was cornered, one palace insider revealed. She believed everyone was turning against her. Instead of remorse, she lashed out. Those who tried to counsel her were dismissed or ignored. The woman who once charmed Britain with her candid warmth had become unpredictable, defensive, and distant. Over the next few days, the situation spiraled further. International leaders who had attended the event expressed concern. The Prime Minister's office called for a briefing on the state of royal stability. Foreign correspondents framed it as a crisis of monarchy, a reminder of its human flaws. Meanwhile, the British public found itself torn between fascination and fatigue. "We thought the drama ended with Harry and Meghan," one columnist wrote. But the real storm was still inside the palace. As pressure mounted, Charles began to retreat into himself. He refused media appearances, canceled engagements, and spent long hours in solitude. His staff grew worried. He was consumed by the need to act, one aide said. He kept saying, "This must be answered. There must be consequence." For a man who valued discipline above all else, the public humiliation was unbearable. It wasn't merely about reputation, it was about control, authority, and the sanctity of the crown. Privately, he sought counsel from his most trusted advisor, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The conversation, according to palace sources, was both spiritual and strategic. The Archbishop reminded him that forgiveness was a virtue, but also cautioned that leadership sometimes demanded painful decisions. "There can be no peace without accountability," he said. The words lingered in the king's mind long after the meeting ended. In the days that followed, the final decision began to take shape. Charles concluded that his wife's removal from the public eye was necessary, not only to preserve the monarchy but to protect her from the scrutiny that would inevitably destroy her further. To the outside world, it would be described as a period of reflection. But to those who knew the truth, it was the beginning of exile. As preparations were quietly made, a handful of senior aides were tasked with managing logistics. The chosen location, a secluded monastery in Scotland, was selected for its discretion and distance. It had served centuries ago as a retreat for disgraced nobility seeking repentance. The symbolism was unmistakable. Camilla, once at the heart of royal power, would now live in quiet obscurity. The night before her departure, she reportedly walked alone through the palace gardens. The moonlight shimmered on the dewy grass, and the air carried the faint scent of roses. Those who saw her said she looked calm, almost resigned. "Perhaps she understood," one attendant said later. "Perhaps she knew this was the only way." When dawn broke, she was gone. The official statement released that morning was brief and polished. "Her Majesty the Queen Consort will be taking an indefinite period of private retreat. His Majesty the King remains committed to his duties and the service of the nation." No further comment was given, but the world understood what it meant. The crisis that began with a single moment of defiance had reshaped the monarchy itself. It wasn't merely about anger or punishment. It was about the limits of love and the price of pride. The king's actions would be debated for generations, but in that moment, his decision was final. The woman who had once been his greatest comfort had become his greatest test. And the cost of that test was exile. The first morning after Camilla's exile was quiet, too quiet for the king's liking. The silence was not peaceful but heavy, like the pause before a storm. Charles had spent the night alone in his private quarters, staring at the ornate ceiling, his thoughts circling endlessly. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. The defiance, the disbelief, the pain that had flashed when she realized he meant it. Exile. The word still echoed through his mind like a tolling bell. It wasn't the kind of punishment he'd ever imagined giving to someone he loved. But love, he told himself, could not stand above duty. Not anymore. Not after what she'd done. When dawn finally came, it brought no relief. The corridors of Buckingham Palace were still dim, and the sound of distant footsteps carried like whispers through the marble halls. A servant knocked softly before entering his room with tea. "Good morning, Your Majesty," the man said carefully. Charles didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the window, watching the mist roll over the palace gardens. He barely noticed the tray placed before him, nor the hesitant glance of the servant who lingered for a moment, sensing something unspoken in the air. When the door closed again, Charles exhaled slowly and pressed his hands together, as if praying for strength he wasn't sure he had. The palace was on edge. The staff walked with measured steps, speaking in hushed tones, afraid to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over everything. For decades, Charles had been known as a man of emotion, passionate, expressive, sometimes even sensitive, but that version of him seemed gone. The king who now walked the corridors was quieter, colder, deliberate in every move. It was as though he had placed his humanity in a locked box, sealing it away to protect the one thing he still had left, the crown. Yet those closest to him knew the truth. Behind the mask of composure, Charles was unraveling. He avoided meals, skipped briefings, and refused to engage in small talk. Even his most trusted aides found him withdrawn, unreachable. When his private secretary suggested postponing some engagements to allow him time to rest, Charles shook his head. "I will not hide," he said flatly. "The monarchy doesn't rest because of heartbreak." His voice was calm, but there was an edge in it, a bitterness that hadn't been there before. That same day, Prince William arrived unannounced. He entered without ceremony, his expression tight, his eyes cautious. Father and son hadn't spoken since the night of Camilla's departure. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. William, ever pragmatic, approached his father's desk. "You shouldn't be alone right now," he said quietly. Charles didn't look up. "I'm not alone," he replied. "I have an entire nation watching my every move." The bitterness in his tone made William pause. "They're watching because they're worried," he said. "They want to see strength, yes, but also compassion. If this looks like banishment, it'll haunt you." Charles finally lifted his gaze, meeting his son's. "It was necessary," he said. "She brought shame on everything we've built. What would you have me do? Pretend it never happened?" William hesitated before answering. "No," he said. "But forgiveness doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." The king leaned back in his chair, studying his son. "Humanity," he murmured, "is what destroyed kings before me. I won't make that mistake." The conversation ended there, with no reconciliation, only understanding that ran too deep to speak aloud. William left the room quietly, and Charles was alone again, the crown heavy on his conscience. Outside the palace, the world continued to dissect his decision. Editorials debated whether the king had gone too far. Talk shows speculated on the couple's private life. Every gesture, every word, every public appearance became evidence for one side or the other. Some saw a man betrayed but resolute, others a tyrant punishing a woman for her imperfections. The palace's silence only fueled the debate. And through it all, Charles watched from a distance, as though observing someone else's life unfold. The breaking point came not from public pressure, but from memory. Late one evening, as he sat in his study surrounded by old letters and photographs, Charles found himself staring at an image of Camilla from years earlier. It was taken during one of their first private outings after Diana's passing. A rare moment of happiness. They were laughing, unguarded, unaware of the camera that captured them. He remembered the warmth of that day, the comfort of her presence, the relief of being understood. It struck him then how far they had drifted. That laughter had been replaced with silence, that intimacy with resentment. Somewhere between duty and desire, they had lost the tenderness that once bound them. He reached for the phone on his desk, his hand trembling slightly. For a fleeting moment, he considered calling the monastery, just to hear her voice, to know she was all right. But then he stopped. What would he even say? That he missed her? That he regretted it? The words felt impossible. Instead, he hung up the phone and poured himself a drink, something he rarely did anymore. The whiskey burned as it went down, and for the first time in days, he let the mask slip. The king put his head in his hands and wept. The following morning, the palace staff noticed the change. Charles's face was pale, his eyes tired but resolute. He attended every meeting, signed every document, and delivered every scheduled address with precision. But those who looked closely could see it, the faint tremor in his hand, the lingering pause before he spoke, the exhaustion in his voice. He was a man performing strength while quietly collapsing under the weight of it. Princess and, ever perceptive, confronted him privately a few days later. "You're driving yourself into the ground," she said. "Grief doesn't vanish because you bury it under work." Charles smiled faintly. "Grief is a luxury and," he said, "I have no time for it." She shook her head. "You're not your mother. You can't handle it all alone." The mention of their mother, the late queen, struck him like a chord. He remembered her quiet dignity, the way she had carried her burdens without complaint. But he also remembered the loneliness in her eyes during her later years. "Perhaps solitude is the price we pay," he said softly, and didn't argue. She knew it was true. Meanwhile, reports from Scotland began trickling back through unofficial channels. Camilla had arrived safely at the monastery, escorted by a discreet royal detail. The abbey's stone walls stood tall against the surrounding hills, weathered but enduring, much like the monarchy itself. She lived in near silence, her days filled with prayer, reading, and reflection. The few who interacted with her described her as withdrawn, contemplative. She asked for no special treatment, no comforts. When one attendant brought her a newspaper, she refused to look at it. "I already know what they're saying," she whispered. "Let them." Her words carried both resignation and defiance. When these updates reached the king, he showed no reaction. But alone they haunted him. The image of Camilla living in isolation, stripped of luxury, stripped of identity, gnawed at his conscience. He had justified his decision as necessary, but now, in the quiet hours of night, it began to feel cruel. He wondered if he had acted out of duty or vengeance. The line between the two was blurring. As weeks passed, cracks began to appear in his composure. During one official engagement, as he greeted a line of war veterans, an elderly woman reached out and said, "Be kind to her, Your Majesty. We all make mistakes." The words pierced through his defenses like an arrow. He forced a polite smile, but those around him noticed the sudden stiffness in his expression. Later that night, he returned to his chambers and sat in silence for hours. The words echoed in his mind long after the event had ended. By the third week of Camilla's absence, the king had reached a state of emotional exhaustion. His private secretary found him sitting alone in the chapel one evening, staring at the altar. "Your Majesty," the aide said softly. Charles didn't move. "Do you think God forgives us for doing what we must?" he asked. The question hung in the air. The aide hesitated. "If the intent is right, perhaps he does," he replied cautiously. Charles nodded faintly. "But what if the intent was to protect myself?" There was no answer. There couldn't be one. The next morning he wrote a letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone publicly, but those who later read it understood it was meant for her. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, yet filled with unspoken emotion. He didn't apologize, not directly, but his words carried remorse between the lines. He wrote of duty, of regret, of love buried beneath necessity. The letter was sent through a confidential courier to the monastery. Whether she ever read it or replied, no one would ever know. When asked later about that period, one of the king's oldest advisors described it simply, "That was when he broke. Not when she embarrassed him, not when he sent her away, but when he realized he couldn't undo it." Power doesn't protect you from heartbreak. It only makes it quieter. And so the king endured, outwardly composed, inwardly fractured. The monarchy stood intact. The public grew quieter, and appearances resumed their familiar rhythm. But those who looked into Charles's eyes during that time saw something had changed. The warmth that once humanized him was gone, replaced by a measured stillness. He was no longer the man who sought harmony. He was the monarch who had learned the cost of control. That winter, when the palace released its annual Christmas photograph, Charles stood alone beside the throne. His hands were clasped, his gaze steady, his crown gleaming under the lights. To the world, it was a picture of strength. But behind the lens, there was a pause, a brief, flickering moment when the photographer said he thought he saw the king blink away a tear. The decision came not in a flurry of royal proclamations or legal decrees, but in the stillness of early morning, when the palace was half asleep and the king was alone with his thoughts. Outside, London was drenched in mist, the sky heavy with rain that refused to fall. The city stirred quietly, unaware that within those ancient walls, a monarch had reached the point of no return. Charles sat at his writing desk, his pen hovering above a blank sheet of parchment, his heart waging a battle between love and power. Every instinct told him to pause, to reconsider, to find another way. But the weight of recent weeks had left him hollow. The scandal, the humiliation, the endless scrutiny, they had eroded something sacred. What remained was a man who no longer sought to repair what was broken, but to contain it. He wrote slowly, his handwriting sharp and deliberate. The letter was addressed not to the nation, not even to the Prime Minister or the Privy Council, but to a select few, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chamberlain, and his private secretary. It was an order cloaked in dignity, but beneath the formality lay a tone of finality. It stated, in carefully measured words, that Her Majesty the Queen Consort would remain in private retreat until such a time as the integrity of the crown is fully restored and peace within the royal household is assured. There were no explanations, no justifications, only the cold precision of a monarch exercising his authority. When he signed his name, Charles R. His hand trembled slightly. He stared at the signature for a long time, knowing what it meant. The seal was applied, the document dispatched, and with it, the exile became permanent. By dawn, the machinery of the palace had begun to turn. Discreet phone calls were made, instructions whispered down corridors. A new layer of secrecy was imposed over the monarchy's most guarded scandal. The monastery in Scotland, once chosen as a temporary refuge, was now to become Camilla's indefinite residence. Only a handful of people were aware of the decision. Even among them, few understood its full gravity. The Archbishop, upon receiving the king's letter, reportedly closed his eyes for a long moment before saying quietly, "So it is done." Meanwhile, in the royal press office, senior aides drafted the public statement that would go out later that day. Every word was debated, softened, and polished until it revealed nothing but implied everything. The final version read simply, "Her Majesty the Queen Consort has requested to extend her period of private reflection. His Majesty the King fully supports this decision and remains focused on his duties to the nation and the Commonwealth." It was elegant in its vagueness, royal in its restraint, and devastating in what it did not say. The world would interpret it as mutual agreement, but those inside the palace knew it for what it truly was: exile imposed and absolute. The rain began to fall by mid-morning, washing over the palace grounds in thin, steady sheets. Inside, the king went about his routine as if nothing had changed. He met with advisors, reviewed documents, and attended a briefing on environmental initiatives, the kind of symbolic gestures that gave structure to his otherwise fractured days. Yet beneath his composure, something cold and unfamiliar had taken root. Each decision he made now seemed tinged with detachment. It was as though he had stepped into a version of himself he neither recognized nor liked, a man defined by consequence rather than conviction. Princess Anne was the first to confront him after learning of the decision. She entered his study unannounced, her tone sharp from the moment she spoke. "You've made it official, haven't you?" she asked. Charles didn't look up. "It was necessary," he said simply. "You mean final," she countered. "Do you even realize what that means?" He met her gaze, unflinching. "It means stability. It means the monarchy survives another generation," and shook her head slowly. "You're convincing yourself it's for the crown, but we both know it's for you. You couldn't bear to see her again, not after what she did. This isn't preservation, Charles. It's punishment." Her words hit harder than she intended, but he didn't show it. "Call it what you will," he said, "but this is what leadership demands." And sighed deeply. "Leadership also demands forgiveness. You're turning into the very thing you despised growing up. A man who hides behind duty because it's easier than facing his heart." For a brief moment, the old warmth flickered between them, brother and sister, bound by shared scars. But then it vanished. "I've made my decision," he said quietly, "and I'll live with it," and studied him for a long time, then nodded. "I hope you can," she said softly before leaving. By evening, the official statement had been released. The media went into overdrive. Television networks interrupted programming. Journalists analyzed every syllable, and headlines screamed speculation. Queen Camilla's extended absence raises questions. Palace confirms indefinite retreat. Is the Queen Consort ever coming back? The British public was divided once more. Some applauded the king's firmness, praising his devotion to tradition. Others accused him of cruelty and hypocrisy, questioning whether he had learned anything from the wounds of the past. Royal watchers debated whether this was Charles's defining act of strength or his greatest mistake. At Balmoral, where the king retreated that weekend, the silence was profound. The Scottish air carried a chill that cut through his coat as he walked the estate grounds alone. The heather fields stretched endlessly before him, the mist swallowing the hills in soft, pale gray. This was the land of his mother, the one place he felt closest to her memory. Yet even here he could find no peace. He thought about the night she died, about how he'd promised himself he would lead differently, with heart, with empathy, with understanding. But leadership, he now realized, had a way of hollowing a man out. It demanded sacrifices that no one could ever truly prepare for. As he walked, his mind returned again and again to Camilla. He pictured her in that monastery, surrounded by stone walls and silence, her laughter replaced by prayer. He wondered if she hated him. He wondered if she understood. Then he wondered if it mattered. Each thought twisted deeper into the pit of his chest until it felt unbearable. He stopped near a stream that cut through the valley, the water rushing over stones worn smooth by time. "You did this," he whispered to himself. The sound of his own voice startled him. "You did this," he said again, louder this time, as though admitting it might ease the guilt pressing against his ribs. But it didn't. Back in London, the inner circle of the royal household worked to reinforce the narrative. Aides coordinated with religious figures to frame Camilla's retreat as an act of devotion rather than disgrace. Private letters were sent to select charities she had supported, explaining that Her Majesty requires a period of private contemplation. Photographs of Charles visiting hospitals and schools were released to the press, a carefully crafted reminder that the king remained active, focused, and compassionate. The illusion of order was taking shape again, though those within the palace knew it was built on fragile ground. Behind closed doors, however, cracks began to reappear. Some senior courtiers, long loyal to Camilla, quietly resigned. Others, emboldened by her absence, began aligning themselves more closely with Prince William and Catherine, sensing a future shift in influence. What had started as a scandal was evolving into a power reconfiguration. Subtle, unseen, but irreversible. The monarchy was healing on the surface, but beneath that calm, it was reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. As for Camilla, no one heard from her directly. Not a single letter, phone call, or message was sent to the palace. The monastery had strict rules of isolation. Communication was limited, visitors prohibited. But occasionally, through whispers from local villagers, fragments of her life there trickled back. They said she spent hours tending to the gardens, that she prayed in the chapel before dawn, that she had stopped using her royal title entirely. One villager claimed to have seen her walking barefoot through the fields in the early morning mist, her face serene, her eyes distant. She looked like a woman who had finally accepted her fate, the villager said. But acceptance was not forgiveness, and forgiveness was something neither she nor Charles had yet found. Weeks later, during a quiet evening in Balmoral, Charles sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The crackle of burning wood filled the room, the only sound in the vast silence of the estate. On the table beside him lay a stack of letters from the public, some supportive, others harsh. He picked one at random and opened it. The handwriting was neat, almost delicate. "Your Majesty," it began, "I cannot imagine the pain of ruling a country while suffering personal heartbreak. But please remember, mercy does not weaken a king. It defines him." Charles folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. He sat still for a long time, the words echoing in his mind. Later that night, he wrote in his journal again. The entry was shorter than usual, but its meaning was unmistakable. "I have won the battle for the crown, but lost the peace of my soul." He closed the book and blew out the candle, leaving the room in darkness. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a restless spirit, and in that sound, he thought he heard her voice. Faint, distant, and full of the same calm defiance that had once captivated him. In the days that followed, Charles threw himself into his duties with renewed vigor. Publicly, he appeared composed, regal, even rejuvenated. Privately, he was hollow. He had made the decision that would define his reign, to protect the monarchy at any cost, but the cost had proven greater than he ever imagined. Exile had restored the crown's image, but it had also exiled his heart. The world saw a king in control. Only those closest to him knew the truth, that behind the title, behind the gold and grandeur, there stood a man who had exiled not only his wife but a part of himself to the shadows. The monastery was silent, but Camilla's thoughts were deafening. In the first days after her arrival, the stillness felt unbearable. Gone were the clicking of heels on marble floors, the soft murmur of attendants outside her door, the perfume of fresh flowers delivered each morning. The life she had known, a life of constant attention, luxury, and ceremony, had vanished in a single night. Now she woke to the tolling of distant church bells and the chill of stone beneath her feet. Her suite, once filled with gold-framed portraits and silk draperies, had been replaced by a small, simple room with whitewashed walls, a wooden cross, and a single window overlooking a windswept valley. When she first arrived, she believed it would be temporary. A cooling period, she told herself. A performance for the press, a staged retreat for the sake of optics. Surely Charles would come to his senses once the noise died down. Surely he would realize what a spectacle he had made of their marriage. But as days turned into weeks and no word came from him, no letter, no call, no message, the anger began to fester. It wasn't just anger at him. It was anger at everyone. At the palace aides who had turned against her, at the courtiers who whispered about her downfall, at the press that painted her as a villain once again. For decades, she had fought to be accepted, to move from scandalous mistress to respected queen. She had endured ridicule, sacrificed privacy, and shaped herself into what the monarchy demanded. And now, after one misstep, it had all been erased. The humiliation was complete. The abbess of the monastery, a quiet woman with kind eyes, treated her with gentle neutrality. She never used Camilla's title, only Mrs. Windsor. At first, that formality stung. Later, it became a relief. It allowed her, for the first time in years, to exist without the suffocating expectations of royalty. Yet even in anonymity, she could not escape herself. Her thoughts looped endlessly, replaying the night of the scandal like a punishment she couldn't outlive. She remembered the applause that had filled the grand hall, the flicker of pride on Charles's face, the ache in her chest as she watched him speak about unity and renewal as if she were not standing beside him, as if she were a prop in his performance. The words she uttered that night, the words that had destroyed her, had not been planned. They had erupted from years of suppressed resentment, years of being told to smile, to stay silent, to never forget she had once been the scandal he had to justify. Unity, she had said. What a funny word coming from a man who divided his own family. She had seen his face in that instant, pale, stunned, broken, and for a second she'd regretted it. But only for a second. Then came the silence, the stares, the slow realization of what she had done. Even as she walked out of the hall, she still believed she could fix it. She had survived worse before, but this time there was no second chance. The first week in the monastery was a blur of disbelief. She refused to eat the simple meals served to her, sending them back untouched. She demanded to speak to the archbishop, to her lawyer, to anyone who could intervene. But no one came. The monastery staff had strict instructions. No visitors, no correspondence, no exceptions. It was exile disguised as retreat. When she realized she was truly cut off, something inside her shattered. Her fury became her only companion. She paced her room for hours, replaying every argument, every insult. She cursed Charles under her breath, sometimes aloud. "He thinks he can erase me?" she muttered one night. "He wouldn't even have that crown without me." She slammed her hands against the window frame, staring out at the endless gray landscape. The wind howled, indifferent, but rage burns fast, and when it fades it leaves only ashes. The silence that followed was heavier than her anger had been. Days began to stretch endlessly. The monastery bells marked the passage of time, but inside her mind, time had stopped. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but think. And in that stillness, regret began to creep in, slow, insidious, uninvited. She started to wonder when exactly she had crossed the line. Not just that night, but long before. Had she become too comfortable, too sure of her place? She thought of the young woman she once was, bold, mischievous, charming. The one who laughed at conventions, who made Charles feel alive. Somewhere along the way, she had lost that woman. In her place stood a queen who measured every word, every smile, every gesture. And when the cracks finally showed, the world pounced. One morning, she awoke before dawn and sat by the window, watching the first pale light creep over the hills. For the first time since arriving, she cried, not out of anger but exhaustion. The tears came quietly, almost without her realizing. It wasn't just sorrow for herself, but for what they had both become. She loved him still, that was the unbearable truth. She hated him for what he'd done, but she couldn't stop loving him. Love, she realized, was her curse. The abbess found her later that morning, sitting silently at the small wooden desk, her breakfast untouched. "You must eat something, Mrs. Windsor," the woman said softly. Camilla looked up, her eyes red. "Does he ever ask about me?" The abbess hesitated, then shook her head. "We receive no word from the palace." Camilla gave a bitter laugh. "Of course not," she said. "The king mustn't trouble himself with ghosts." In the weeks that followed, something in her began to shift. The initial rage had burned itself out, replaced by a strange clarity. The rhythm of monastic life, the prayers, the simplicity, the absence of pretense, began to seep into her. She started tending the garden behind the chapel, her hands raw from the cold soil. She took long walks along the cliffs, breathing in the sea air until her lungs ached. She even began to join the sisters for morning prayers, not out of faith but out of a need for something greater than her own thoughts. In those quiet hours, she began to understand the enormity of what she had lost. Not just the crown or the privilege, but the person she had been beside him. She remembered their laughter in the early years, the stolen glances across crowded rooms, the nights spent talking about everything and nothing. They had once promised each other peace after decades of turmoil. Instead, they had created a new kind of war, one fought not with scandal but with silence. One afternoon, as she sat beneath an old oak tree near the monastery's edge, she saw a bird struggling against the wind, its wings trembling but refusing to give up. She watched it for a long time until it disappeared into the horizon. It reminded her of herself, battered, directionless, but still moving. That night, she wrote in a small notebook given to her by one of the sisters. The handwriting was unsteady, but her words were clear. "I was never meant to be queen. I was meant to be his peace. And I became his storm." That confession marked a turning point. The bitterness didn't vanish, but it softened. She began speaking to the abbess more often, not as a queen, but as a woman searching for understanding. They talked about guilt, forgiveness, and the futility of pride. The abbess told her that silence could heal, but only if one listened to it rather than resisted it. Camilla took that to heart. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, a letter arrived. It bore no royal seal, only her name in familiar handwriting. Her heart stopped. For a long moment, she just stared at it, afraid to open it. When she finally did, her hands trembled. It was from Charles. The words were few but deliberate. He spoke of duty, of reflection, of regret. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even mention